That day at the hospital, making my patients' dreams come true, was one of the most thrilling experiences of my life. It all started this fall. I was a few weeks into my new nursing rotation when I first met Elliot. He was the kind of patient that blended into the background, at first quiet, polite, and unassuming. His chart labeled him as he was recovering from a fractured leg sustained during a biking accident. His injuries weren't life-threatening, and I expected my interactions with him would be minimal, simply the normal checks and care. But from the moment I entered his room, I felt something shift. "Good morning, Mateo," I said, keeping my tone friendly but professional. "I'm your nurse today. How's the pain?" His beautiful dark eyes met mine, and for a brief moment I forgot the question I had just asked. There was something about his gaze, steady, almost intense, that caught me off guard. He offered a small smile, his voice warm but tinged with exhaustion. "Manageable," he replied. "Thanks for asking, Clara," I said, pulling a stool closer to his bedside. "Just Clara is fine." His smile widened slightly, and I couldn't help but notice how it softened his sharp features. I chastised myself internally for the thought this was work, nothing more. I went about the usual tasks, checking his vitals and making notes on his recovery. Matter was cooperative, answering my questions with a quiet humor that surprised me. He seemed determined to keep things light. Even when I asked about the pain or the physical therapy regimen he was dreading. "You've got a knack for this," he said, as I adjusted his making people feel at ease. "I mean, part of the job," I replied with a shrug, though his compliment lingered in my mind longer than it should have. Over the next few days, I found myself assigned to Elliot more often than I expected. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe it was because I seemed to handle his care efficiently. Either way, I didn't mind. His presence was calming in a way I couldn't quite explain. He wasn't demanding or overly chatty like some patients, but he had a way of making every interaction feel personal. "Don't tell me you're stuck with me again today," he teased one afternoon as I entered his room. "Lucky you," I shot back with a grin, trying to keep things professional, even as I felt a faint blush creep up my neck. It became a rhythm, this easy banter that hovered just on the edge of something more. I told myself it was harmless, just a patient and a nurse building rapport. But there were moments when I caught him watching me with a look that made my chest tighten. One evening I stayed late to finish up paperwork. The ward was quieter than usual, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the halls. I hadn't planned to visit Elliot again before heading home, but as I walked past his room I saw him sitting up in bed, staring out the window. Something about the way he looked lost in thought. His expression, unusually solemn, made me pause. I knocked gently on the doorframe. "Can't sleep?" He turned, surprised to see me, but not displeased. "Not really, too much on my mind." "Want to talk about it?" I asked. Stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, Elliot hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his blanket. "I don't want to bore you." "You won't," I said, pulling up the same stool I'd sat on during our first meeting. "Promise." He exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to his lap. "It's just being stuck here makes you think about a lot of things, stuff you've ignored or put off dealing with." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "Like how much I've let life pass me by," he said. "Finally. I was always so focused on work, on chasing this idea of success, and now I don't know. It feels like I've missed something important." His vulnerability caught me off guard. I wasn't sure what to say, but I didn't want to leave his words hanging in the air unanswered. "It's not too late," I said softly, "to figure out what you're missing to change things." Elliot looked up, then his eyes searching mine. "You really believe that I do?" I said. And I meant it. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The air between us felt heavy, charged with an energy I didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. "Thanks, Clara," he said eventually, his voice quieter than before, "for listening, for not making me feel stupid." "You're not stupid," I said, standing to leave, "and you're not alone either. Remember that." As I walked out of his room, I felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. I told myself it was just the nature of the job, that connecting with patients on a human level was part of being a good nurse. But deep down I knew there was more to it than that. Elliot wasn't just another patient, and that realization scared me more than I wanted to admit. For the next few shifts, I tried to keep my distance. I swapped assignments with colleagues whenever possible, convincing myself that it was for the best. But avoiding Elliot was harder than I expected. Every time I saw him in the hallway or caught a glimpse of his name on the patient list, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Then one evening, as I was getting ready to leave, I found a note slipped into my locker. The handwriting was neat, familiar. "Clara, if you're not in a rush tonight, I'd like to talk. Room 3-4. Elliot." My first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but curiosity got the better of me. I told myself it was probably something innocent, a question about his recovery or a request for clarification on his discharge plan. But as I approached his room, my heart raced with a mix of anticipation and dread. When I stepped inside, Mateo was sitting on the edge of the bed, his injured leg propped up on a pillow. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "You came," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Of course," I replied, closing the door behind me. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor for the first time since I'd met him. He looked genuinely nervous. "There's something I need to say," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I don't know if it's the painkillers talking or if I'm just an idiot. But I can't keep it to myself anymore." My breath caught in my throat as I waited for him to continue, my mind racing with possibilities. "I think I like you," he said. Finally, his words tumbling out in a rush, "more than I should. And I know this is probably the worst idea in the world. But I couldn't not say it." I stared at him, stunned into silence. Of all the things I'd expected him to say, this wasn't one of them. "I'm sorry," he added quickly, misinterpreting my silence. "I shouldn't have." "It's okay," I interrupted, my voice steadier than I felt. "You don't have to apologize." Mateo looked up then, his eyes filled with uncertainty and something else, hope. "Maybe I had to tell you," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "even if nothing comes of it. I needed you to know. I didn't know what to say." My heart was pounding, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. But one thing was clear this moment. This connection was something I couldn't ignore, and as I stood there, frozen, the weight of Elliot's words hanging in the air between us, my thoughts raced, tangling together in a chaotic mess of logic and emotion. I was supposed to be a professional, the one in control. Yet here I was feeling anything but. Elliot shifted uncomfortably on the edge of the bed, his hands gripping the blanket as if bracing himself for a rejection. His vulnerability tugged at something deep inside me, a part of myself I usually kept buried under layers of duty and professionalism. "Elliot," I began, my voice softer than I expected. "This is unexpected, I know," he said quickly, cutting me off. "I'm sorry, Clara. I don't want to make things awkward for you, and I definitely don't want to jeopardize your job or anything. It's okay." I interrupted, stepping closer to him. "You don't need to explain." He looked up at me, then his dark eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. "I've been sitting here all day, going back and forth about whether I should say anything. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop thinking about you. My heart thudded loudly in my chest and I knew he could probably hear it in the silence of the room. Elliot. This is complicated. I get that, he said, his voice steady. Despite the tension I could see in his posture. I just needed you to know, even if nothing happens. Even if this is all in my head. I had to tell you. The raw honesty in his words left me speechless. I had spent my entire career focusing on being the reliable, composed professional who never let emotions cloud judgment. But in this moment I felt exposed, like he could see through every mask I'd ever worn. I don't know what to say, I admitted, finally pulling the stool closer and sitting down beside him. You don't have to say anything, he replied. I'm not expecting anything from you, Ma. I just... He hesitated, his gaze dropping to his lap. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. The sincerity in his voice, the way he said my name, it made my chest ache. I couldn't deny that there was a connection between us, something unspoken that had been building since the day we met. But acknowledging it felt dangerous, like stepping onto a path I couldn't turn back from. Elliot, I said, my voice steadying as I tried to process my thoughts. You're an incredible person and I care about you. But this situation, it's not simple. There are lines we shouldn't cross. He nodded, though his expression remained guarded. I know. And if you want me to forget about this, I will. I promise. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to tell him to forget, to pretend this moment had never happened. But another part, when I hadn't fully acknowledged until now, wanted to stay. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Mateo broke it, his voice softer this time. Can I ask you something? Of course, I said, bracing myself for whatever was coming next. Have you ever felt this way before about someone you weren't supposed to? The question caught me off guard and I hesitated, my mind flashing through memories I'd buried long ago. I thought about the moments I'd ignored, the fleeting connections I'd dismissed because they didn't fit into the life I'd built for myself. Yes, I admitted. Finally, the word feeling heavy on my tongue. I have. Elliot's eyes softened and he nodded, as if my answer confirmed something he'd suspected all along. Then you understand. I did, and that was what scared me the most. You deserve someone who can give you everything, I said, forcing the words out even though they felt like they were tearing something inside me. Someone who doesn't have to second guess every step they take with you. But what if I don't want that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if I just want this us here now? I felt the air leave my lungs as his words settled over me. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to step back, to put an end to this before it went too far. But the rest of me, the part that had felt drawn to him from the moment we met, wanted nothing more than to stay. Elliot, I started, but before I could finish he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small gesture, so tentative and fleeting, yet it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I didn't pull away, and neither did he. I'm not asking for forever, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hand. I'm just asking for now, for whatever this is. I searched his face looking for any hint of hesitation or doubt, but all I saw was sincerity. He wasn't trying to manipulate me or push me into something I didn't want. He was simply laying his feelings bare, trusting me to do the same. My breath hitched as I made my decision, the weight of it settling over me like a heavy but oddly comforting blanket. I didn't know what the future would hold, or if this was a mistake I would come to regret. But in this moment, with Elliot looking at me like I was the only person in the world, I couldn't bring myself to care. I leaned in slightly, closing the distance between us. His eyes widened in surprise, but he didn't pull away. This is insane, I whispered, my voice trembling. Maybe, he replied, his lips curving into a small, hopeful smile. But sometimes the best things are. Before I could second myself, I closed the remaining space between us, our lips meeting in a hesitant but electrifying kiss. It was tentative at first, as if we were both testing the waters, but it didn't take long for the intensity to build. For a moment, the rest of the world faded away, leaving only the two of us. Every fear, every hesitation vanished into the background as I lost myself in the warmth of his touch and the tranquil certainty of his embrace. When we finally pulled away, both of us breathless, I looked into his eyes and saw something I hadn't expected: peace. "I don't know where this is going," I admitted, my voice shaky but honest, "but I don't want to stop then." "Don't," Elliot said simply, his hands still resting on mine. "We'll figure it out together." And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to believe him. Although I did not know what was still coming, I stayed there sitting close to Elliot, our breaths still mingling in the quiet of his hospital room. The weight of what had just happened pressed against me, both thrilling and terrifying. He didn't move his hand away, and I didn't either. For a long moment we just sat there, letting the silence say everything words couldn't. "Clara?" he said softly, his voice pulling me back to the moment. "Are you okay?" I nodded, though my heart was still racing. "I guess so," I said. "My voice is quiet. This is a lot." He gave me a small, reassuring smile. "I know I'm sorry if I made things harder for you." I shook my head, meeting his gaze. "It's not your fault, Elliot. I wasn't expecting any of this." "Neither was I," he admitted. "But now that it's here, I don't want to ignore it." His words sent a shiver through me. There was something so disarmingly honest about the way he spoke, as if he wasn't afraid of the consequences, as long as he was telling the truth. I admired that about him, even as it scared me. I'd spent so long keeping my emotions in check, avoiding anything that might jeopardize the carefully constructed life I'd built. And yet here he was breaking through all of it with nothing but sincerity. "Elliot," I began, searching for the right words. Whatever this is, it's complicated. You're my patient. I'm supposed to what he interrupted gently, pretend there's nothing between us." I hesitated, caught between my professional instincts and the pull I felt toward him. "I don't know," I admitted. "Finally, I've never been in a situation like this before." "Neither have I," he said with a soft laugh, the sound lightening the heaviness in the room. "But if you're willing to figure it out, I am as well." I wanted to say yes, to throw caution to the wind and let myself feel something real for the first time in years. But the practical part of me, the part that had always kept me grounded, held me back. There were so many reasons this couldn't work, so many ways it could go wrong, and yet sitting there with him, all of those reasons seemed to pale in comparison to the way he made me feel. "I don't want to hurt you," I said. Finally, my voice barely above a whisper, "or make promises I can't keep." He reached out then, his hand brushing against my cheek in a gesture so tender it made my chest ache. "I'm not asking for promises, Clara, just honesty. Whatever this is, I want it to be real." The word hung in the air between us, its weight settling over me like a warm, comforting blanket. I'd spent so much of my life trying to live up to expectations, to be the person everyone else needed me to be. But with Elliot, I felt like I could finally let that go. He wasn't asking me to be perfect or to have all the answers, he just wanted me, flaws and all. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside reminded me of where we were. I pulled back slightly, my gaze darting toward the door. "We shouldn't do this here," I said, my voice tinged with urgency. "Anyone could walk in." Elliot nodded, his expression understanding but reluctant. "You're right," he said, his voice tinged with disappointment. but that doesn't mean this has to end the way," he said. It made my heart skip a beat. There was a quiet determination in his tone, a promise that he wasn't ready to let this go. And as much as I wanted to be cautious, I couldn't deny that I felt the same way. "I'll come back later." I said the words spilling out before I could stop myself. After my shift, his eyes lit up with a mixture of surprise and hope. "You mean that?" I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief in making the decision I do, "but we have to be careful." He smiled, then the kind of smile that made my chest feel impossibly full. "I can do careful." The rest of my shift passed in a blur, my mind too preoccupied to focus on anything else. Every time I tried to push the thought of Elliot away, it came rushing back with even more intensity. By the time I finally clocked out, my nerves were shot and my heart felt like it was going to beat out of my chest. I found myself standing outside his room again, hesitating for just a moment before knocking softly. When the door opened and I stepped inside, he was sitting up in bed, his face lighting up. The moment he saw me, "You came," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I said I would," I replied, closing the door behind me. The room felt different, now quieter, more intimate. The hum of the medical monitors seemed to fade into the background as I moved closer to him, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was doing or where this was going, but I knew I couldn't walk away. "I've been thinking about you all day," Elliot admitted, his voice soft but steady. "I kept wondering if I'd imagined everything or if you'd changed your mind." "I almost did," I confessed, taking a seat beside him, "but I couldn't stop thinking about you either." His gaze softened, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The silence wasn't awkward or tense. It was filled with an unspoken understanding, a connection that didn't need words to be felt. "I don't know what this means," I said. Finally, my voice trembling slightly, "but I want to find out." Mateo reached for my hand, then his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that felt both simple and profound. "We'll figure it out together," he said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. As I sat there with him, our hands clasped and our hearts racing, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. For once I wasn't thinking about the rules or the consequences. I was just thinking about him. And for the first time in a long time, that felt adequate. Mateo's hands stayed in mine, his thumb brushing against my knuckles in a slow, soothing rhythm. The stillness between us was heavy with anticipation. Neither of us entirely sure what came next. I felt exposed, vulnerable. In a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in years, yet sitting here with him, it didn't feel wrong. It felt inevitable. "Clara," he said softly, breaking the silence, "I've never met anyone like you." I smiled, faintly shaking my head. "Elliot, you don't have to say things like that, but I mean it." He insisted, his grip on my hand tightening just slightly. "You're different, not just because you're my nurse. It's the way you look at me, the way you care. It's been a long time since I felt like someone really sees me." His words caught me off guard, stirring something deep in my chest. I'd spent my entire career caring for people, but with Elliot it felt personal. I didn't just want to heal his body. I wanted to mend whatever parts of him had been broken long before he walked through the hospital doors. "You make it easy to care." I said, the words slipping out before I could think them through. He smiled, a genuine warmth spreading across his face. "You don't know what that means to me." We stayed like that for a while, the quiet intimacy of the moment wrapping around us like a blanket for the first time all day. I felt at ease, but the rational part of my brain was still screaming at me to keep my distance, to remember the boundaries I was supposed to uphold. "I should go," I said, reluctantly, pulling my hand away. "It's late and I don't want anyone to stay." He interrupted, his voice low and almost pleading, "Just a little longer." I hesitated, my gaze locked with his. The vulnerability in his eyes was impossible to ignore. He wasn't just asking me to stay for his sake. He was asking me to stay for mine. Against my better judgment, I nodded okay, but just for a little while. Mateo's face softened with relief and he shifted over, slightly patting the edge of the bed. I sat down, careful to keep some space between us, but the air felt charged with something unspoken. My pulse quickened as he leaned back against the pillows, his gaze never leaving mine. "Tell me something about you," he said. His voice gentle but insistent, something real. I blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Like what, anything?" He replied, "I just want to know you." The sincerity in his tone made it impossible to deflect. I thought for a moment before speaking. I became a nurse because I wanted to make a difference. I began, my voice steady, but somewhere along the way, it started to feel like I was just going through the motions, like I wasn't really making an impact anymore. Mateo's brow furrowed slightly. "That can't be true. You've already made a difference for me." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt a lump form in my throat. "Maybe," I said softly, "but it's easy to lose sight of that when you're surrounded by so much pain every day." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that life has a way of wearing you down. Doesn't it?" "It does." I agreed, "but you remind me why I started in the first place. You make me want to try again." Elliot reached for my hand once more, his touch grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. "You're more than you give yourself credit for, Clara. You've helped me in ways I didn't think were possible." My chest tightened and I looked away, unable to hold his gaze. "You're giving me too much credit." "No," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm not." The silence that followed was thick with emotion, and I found myself leaning toward him. Before I even realized what I was doing, his breath hitched and for a moment the world seemed to stop. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, our lips met. The kiss was tentative at first, a gentle exploration that quickly deepened as we gave in to the moment. His hands slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him. Every rational thought faded away, replaced by the overwhelming need to feel connected to him. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless. Mateo's eyes searched mine, as if trying to gauge my reaction. "Clara," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "If this is too much, it's not." I interrupted, my voice steady, despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. "I want this. I want you." A slow smile spread across his face and he reached up to cut my cheek. "I've wanted you. From the moment I met you." The weight of his confession settled over me, but instead of feeling burdened, I felt free for the first time in what felt like forever. I was letting myself feel without fear or hesitation, and it was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I leaned in again, capturing his lips in another kiss, this one more urgent than the last. His hands roamed over my back, pulling me closer, and I felt myself giving in completely. There were no more doubts, no more second-guessing in this moment. Nothing else mattered but him. The kiss deepened, pulling us into a world that felt like it was just ours. Mateo's hands moved over my back, his touch both reassuring and exploratory. I found myself gripping his shoulders, steadying myself against the overwhelming intensity of it all, his warmth, his breath, the way he seemed to meet me halfway in every movement. It was like we had been waiting for this moment far longer than either of us realized. "Clara," he murmured against my lips, his voice husky and low. "I've dreamed about this." I paused, pulling back just enough to see his face. His expression was raw, unguarded, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "You have?" He nodded, brushing his thumb along my jawline. I tried to push it down, tell myself it was just gratitude or admiration. But it's more than that. You make me feel alive again, and let me tell you that my dream didn't end with only some kissing. The vulnerability in his words hit me like a tidal wave. For weeks I had been trying to keep things professional, to ignore the pull I felt toward him. But now, hearing him say what I had been afraid to admit to myself, I couldn't hold back anymore. "You're not the only one," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been fighting this for so long, trying to convince myself it was wrong, but I can't anymore." His gaze softened, and he reached up to brush a stray strand of hair from my forehead. "Then don't," he said simply, his voice filled with quiet conviction. The simplicity of his words broke down the last of my resistance. I leaned in again, my lips finding his in a kiss that was deeper, hungrier than before. This time there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. The weight of all the boundaries I'd tried to uphold seemed to fall away, leaving only the undeniable connection between us. Elliot shifted slightly, his hands finding my waist as he guided me closer. I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my palm, and it grounded me in a way I hadn't expected, and so I went down, making, I think, both our dreams come true. While I was busy, I heard him mumble a couple words, but from that I knew he was enjoying for all the chaos swirling in my mind. Being with him felt calm, certain, as though this was exactly where I was meant to be. As I noticed the end was near, I moved up and turned myself around so that he could finish the job, and so he did. Wow. This was amazing. After we were done, we were quiet for a minute or two. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, breaking the silence. His injuries, his recovery, none of it had left my mind, even in the heat of the moment. He smiled, a lopsided grin that made my heart ache with how genuine it was. "I'm more than okay," he replied, his voice tinged with amusement. "But if you're worried about me, maybe you should stay a little longer, just to make sure." I laughed, the sound light and unguarded. "You're impossible." You know, that maybe he teased, his fingers skimming lightly over my sides. "But you seem to like me anyway. Don't get cocky," I warned, though the smile on my face betrayed the seriousness of my words. "I wouldn't dream of it," he replied, his voice softening. I want to hold on to this. To you." His words stole the air from my lungs for a moment. I could only stare at him, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his gaze. This wasn't just about desire or attraction. It was something deeper, something neither of us had been prepared for, but couldn't deny. "You've got me," I said. Finally, the words carrying a weight I hadn't anticipated. "For as long as you want." Elliot didn't reply with words. Instead, he pulled me into another kiss, his hands firm and steady as they held me close. The world outside, his hospital room, faded away, leaving only the two of us in the dim light of the bedside lamp. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe, like I had found something worth holding on to. As the hours stretched into the early morning, we stayed wrapped up in each other, talking in hushed tones and sharing quiet moments that felt stolen from reality. There was an intimacy in the stillness, a sense of safety that I hadn't realized I'd been searching for. "I don't want this to end," Elliot said at one point, his voice heavy with exhaustion but laced with a quiet determination. "Neither do I." I admitted, my head resting against his chest. His hand moved gently over my back, the motion soothing and steady. "We'll figure it out," he murmured, his words more a promise than a suggestion. "Whatever it takes, we'll figure it out." And as I closed my eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, I believed him for the first time in what felt like forever. I allowed myself to hope for something real, something lasting, something that felt like it could be ours to this day. I still think back about this moment a lot. I'm not sure if it's okay to do what I did as someone's nurse, What do you think about it? Please let me know in the comments.